Absolutely right. And because we also have to understand that some of these operators were already fragile before this crisis. A fuel shock and confidence shock do not create those weaknesses, they expose them. The risk is not always outright failure. Sometimes it is slower erosion, weaker punctuality, poorer connectivity, more treasury pressure, delayed fleet decisions, and larger dependence on shareholder support.
And for governments, that raises a real strategic question. Is the airline being funded as a commercial enterprise, a national utility, a tourism instrument, or a political symbol? In periods of stability, these distinctions can be blurred, and in a fuel and airspace shock, they can become very important. So for smaller state-owned airlines, this is where structural weakness becomes visible. Hello and welcome to the Stratos 12 consultancy. This podcast is titled The Gulf Crisis and International Aviation, What It Means to Airlines, Passengers and Vulnerable Markets. My name is Barry Eustace. I'm a partner at the Stratos 12 Partnership.
Good afternoon, I'm Remco Althuis. I'm also a partner at the Stratos 12 Partnership.
Between us, we have spent decades in aviation, in airline leadership, flight operations, commercial strategy, and transformation.
And today we are looking at the impact of the Gulf crisis on international aviation, not just in the Gulf itself, but across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the island economies that depend heavily on air connectivity. We will also look at what this means for consumers, for smaller state-owned airlines, and for strategic projects such as Riyadh Air.
It's worth saying at the outset that this is not just a Middle East story. The Gulf sits at the center of long-haul aviation. It links Europe, Asia, it links Europe with Asia, Asia with Africa, and supports a very large share of the hub-based connecting traffic. So when conflict erupts in this region, the consequences are truly global. This isn't just a regional aviation problem, it's a network shock.
You're right, Barry. So if we look at what the Gulf crisis has actually changed, well, the first thing it has changed is not insurance. It is operational certainty. Airlines have had to work around closures, restrictions, temporary shutdowns, and much narrower safe corridors. In practical terms, that means longer routes, more tactical diversion planning, more fuel carried, more disruption to crew duty patterns, and less slack in schedule.
And we should remember how serious that disruption became at its peak. When major Gulf hubs are affected by airport or airspace disruption, the impact's not only localized, it runs quickly through schedules, connections, and aircraft rotations.
You're right, and that matters because airlines are systems businesses. They do not absorb a disruption one flight at a time. A longer route on one sector can knock into aircraft rotations, maintenance windows, crew legalities, onward banks and customer connections. So the crisis has raised costs both directly and indirectly. Directly through fuel, indirectly through lower utilization, recovery cost, and reduced schedule integrity.
And in other words, flights may still operate, but they do so with less margin, more cost, and critically more fragility.
Yes. And so the first casualty of this crisis is not so much demand, it is operating certainty.
So what is driving airline cost increases? The largest cost driver has been fuel. That's the central commercial fact. When airlines are forced onto longer tracks and fuel prices rise sharply at the same time, the impact is immediate and it is material.
And that is, I think, the point that many interviews miss. Airlines are changing routings mainly because of safety and airspace risk. But the commercial pain is coming mainly through fuel and operational disruption. Those costs then feed into fares, surcharges, capacity decisions, and route economics.
And insurance matters, but it's not the first order driver. It's better understood as a selective pressure and a commercial constraint layered on top of safety, fuel, and route disruption, rather than as the main reason the airlines are actually changing their networks.
You're right. So the hierarchy here matters. Safety drives the route decision. Fuel drives the cost shock. Insurance may amplify pressure, but it's not the core story.
So really, what we need to take out of this is that safety changes the route, fuel changes the economics, and that's an important dynamic in this whole consideration.
And if you look at the impact on the Middle East current existing airlines, but also have a look at the newly launched airlines like Riyadh Air, starting with the existing Middle East airlines, the immediate effect on established Gulf carriers is pressure on the core strengths of their model: reliability, scale, connectivity, and hub efficiency. If your model depends on moving large volumes of passengers across a central hub, then route instability and airspace caution hit the heart of the operation.
And the established carriers do have advantages. They tend to have stronger balance sheets, critical in the airline industry as elsewhere, but particularly important where the margins are so thin. Better operations control, more dispatch capability, and more network flexibility than many of the smaller airlines. That means they can offer recovery faster than weaker rivals, but they're still exposed for sure.
Yeah. And considering that Riyadh Air, based out of Riyadh, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, had plans to start operations fully this year, the issue is not simply whether it can launch. The issue is whether a new hub proposition can build momentum in a more volatile regional backdrop. A new airline needs confidence, timing, clean execution, and a stable narrative. Conflict does not make launch impossible, but it does make early execution harder and less forgiving.
And for established Gulf carriers, this is an operating and cost challenge. For Riyadh Air, it's that plus timing and confidence, a real challenge. So for Gulf carriers, this is a resilience test. For Riyadh Air, it's a launch test.
And if we stay a bit closer to home and look at the impact on the European airlines.
Yeah, European airlines face a different problem. For them, the Gulf crisis compounds an already constrained long-haul operating geography. Many are still working around the loss of Russian airspace. Add disruption in parts of the Middle East, and you end up with fewer efficient route options between Europe and Asia.
And that creates both cost pressure and strategic pressure. Longer routings reduce efficiency, higher fuel prices weaken margin, and schedule resilience becomes harder to protect. Some airlines will cut exposure, some will redeploy aircraft, and some will reshape their networks around stronger alternatives.
And then there's also the supply angle, the fuel supply angle. If Europe remains materially dependent on imported jet fuel from the Middle East, then this is not just a route problem, it's just a supply chain problem, and that's a real problem here.
Yeah, but that said, the impact is not uniformly negative. Some European carriers may also benefit from traffic shifting back towards Europe, particularly in short-haul leisure and in markets where travelers choose to avoid the Gulf. One example being, many of our listeners will know that 50% of all the Australia to Europe traffic is routed through the Gulf. And I've seen reports that customers are actually booking to and from Australia via the west coast of the United States. So carriers carry customers from, let's say, Sydney or Melbourne to Los Angeles and San Francisco, and then they take their European partners back into Europe, which of course drives up demand on those routes, increasing their revenue potential.
And so, as Remco so cleanly pointed out there, the European airlines have been squeezed on cost, routing, and flexibility. But as we just heard, not all of them are going to lose equally. So let's look at the impact on consumer confidence and consumer spending. Let's talk about consumers, because this is where aviation economics meets psychology, as always. Remco.
Well, this matters a great deal, obviously, for the Gulf, particularly for the UAE, as both a destination and a transit hub. When travelers begin to question whether a trip is safe, smooth, and worth the fare, confidence weakens quickly, often before demand disappears completely.
That does not mean people stop traveling altogether, as indeed we saw following September the 11th. What it often means, first, is hesitation, price sensitivity, and a shift in destination choice, as Remco's just highlighted regarding the Australasian and Pacific routes. Travelers ask themselves three questions. 1, is it safe? 2, is it reliable? And 3, is it still worth the fare?
Yeah, and as I'm based here in the Netherlands, customers are increasingly booking to European destinations and also the Caribbean. So airlines then add more capacity into the Caribbean. We'll see what the United States demand will do. We do have a World Cup, but then we also have some political infighting. But we'll see how that goes. And obviously, there's also the spending side. Even where demand holds up, airlines are pushing through higher fares, fuel surcharges, and ancillary charges to recover costs. So consumer spending on travel is being pushed up by cost inflation, at the same time as confidence is becoming less stable.
And for the UAE, that means the issue is not simply whether Dubai remains open. The real commercial question is whether travelers continue to see it as the most seamless and dependable gateway in the region. From a takeaway for this segment is, in travel markets, confidence slips before traffic does.
Some of our listeners will know that I worked at Air Seychelles. And so I also want to put some emphasis on the impact on small island developing states and other connectivity-dependent markets. I believe this is a very and probably one of the most important themes and often the least discussed. Small islands and remote economies, such as the Seychelles, the Maldives, Mauritius, Sri Lanka, are disproportionately exposed to shocks in long-haul aviation because air connectivity is not just convenient for them, it is economically foundational.
And these markets don't usually have the depth or redundancy of large continental economies. If fares rise, frequencies fall, or transfer traffic becomes less reliable, and the impact is significantly magnified, as we've seen.
A place like the Seychelles or Mauritius depends heavily on inbound long-haul leisure traffic. The Maldives is even more tourism dependent. Sri Lanka and parts of Africa and Asia depend on both tourism and diaspora or business connectivity. So when the Gulf becomes more expensive or less predictable, these countries feel it quickly because Gulf hubs are often the bridge that links them to Europe, Asia, and beyond.
And there's a second order effect as well. If large airlines rationalize capacity, they tend to protect their strongest trunk routes first. Marginal leisure or island routes can lose frequency before the flagship city pairs do. That may leave the market technically connected, but with fewer seats, worse timings, and higher fares.
Yeah, and case in point here is, for instance, the Seychelles. Qatar Airways pulled out of that market and has not come back, although they do operate flights to the larger centers like Paris and London. And for African and Asian countries beyond the islands, the same principle applies, where long-haul connectivity is dependent on Gulf hubs. So the smaller and more remote the market, the harder this shock lands.
And it can be existential. So let's look at the impact on smaller state-owned airlines. Now let's look at these carriers in detail. And Remco, we think that they're especially vulnerable, don't we?
Yeah, we do, because they often face 4 structural disadvantages. First, they usually have less fuel hedging and less pricing power. Second, their fleets are often smaller, which means less network flexibility. Third, they may carry social or political obligations that make pure commercial rationalization harder. And fourth, they can be highly exposed to a small number of markets or transfer flows.
And in a crisis like this, that combination is, to put it mildly, awkward. Larger groups can move aircraft, reduce frequencies, optimize fleet deployment, and lean on their strongest markets. But for the smaller state-owned carriers, they often can't.
Absolutely right. Because we also have to understand that some of these operators were already fragile before this crisis. A fuel shock and confidence shock do not create those weaknesses, they expose them. The risk is not always outright failure. Sometimes it is slower erosion, weaker punctuality, poorer connectivity, more treasury pressure, delayed fleet decisions, and larger dependence on shareholder support.
And for governments, that raises a real strategic question. Is the airline being funded as a commercial enterprise, a national utility, a tourism instrument, or a political symbol? In periods of stability, these distinctions can be blurred, and in a fuel and airspace shock, they can become very important. So for smaller state-owned airlines, this is where structural weakness becomes visible. One of the effects of this whole Gulf crisis and crises similar to it, and we've had multiple ones that include September the 11th, the global financial crisis, volcanic ashing around Iceland at the time when that closed a lot of the North Atlantic, is that particularly smaller operators are finding themselves with a huge amount to deal with, a very limited window of opportunity, resilience issues, and the need for greater capacity around their thinking processes. And this is something that we've identified with our executive decision acceleration model, which is where the members of the Stratos 12 partnership, Remco with his commercial and senior leadership background, Richard Nanton with his flight operations background, me with my operational and industrial relations background, Jean-Marc with his MRO and asset management background, come in and really support small teams in airlines who are finding that they need additional thinking, time, capacity, and impartial, objective, independent, and highly informed and professional advice to come in and support them. Remco, perhaps you'd just like to expand upon that.
And so airlines that have limited fleet units and that have parts of their network being closed off. For instance, if they were operating into the Gulf and they have these aircraft available, the connectivity of the country could be under tremendous pressure, meaning that there's a drop in tourism arrivals. They may have to reinvent themselves under tremendous short time window, open new routes, start flying to countries that they haven't flown for or not for a long time, where they lack distribution, where they don't really have the fares filed, where they don't really know the market, to take over from the incumbent airlines that used to operate there, just to ensure that there is a steady flow of tourism arrivals into that country. So these teams are tremendously stretched because they have to do all of these things in a very short window, make new flight plans, launch flights, make flight plans, launch distribution, fares, look at the products, all to support the economy of the country that they operate out of. So there's lots of decisions, lots of scenarios to be looked at, lots of new insights that they need to be gained in a very short time. And having somebody on the outside that could help them take those decisions or shape those decisions or just act as a sounding board.
Again, bringing in with our strategic partners capabilities for change, industrial relations with their technical crews and so forth. So we're there to support you and your airline at any time. And if you'd like to, just contact us at stratos12.com. Our telephone number is also on the website, or you can email us at partners@stratos12.com, and we'll be delighted to see when and where we can help you through this crisis.
Let's have a look at the impact on the cargo and trade dependent markets.
Yeah, cargo deserves a brief section here because it often tells you how deep the disruption really is.
Cargo is usually the early warning signal. If rates rise sharply and reliability weakens, it tells you the disruption is no longer just an airline scheduling issue. It is starting to affect trade flows and economic competitiveness.
And for island states and smaller economies, cargo disruption is not just a logistics inconvenience. It can affect medical supply chains, export reliability, and the attractiveness of the country as an investment location. If your economy is remote, reliable air cargo is part of your competitiveness. And I know I've lived on an island.
I have too, and I know that a lot of the cargo coming into Seychelles, for instance, is being carried on just one or two airlines, so they're really exposed there. So cargo should therefore not be treated as a side issue. It is one of the clearest indicators of whether a regional conflict is starting to become a wider economic problem.
So the takeaway from this is that when cargo suffers, the problem has moved beyond aviation and into the real economy.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about crew safety and operational resilience. From a flight operations standpoint, which is something that is very familiar to me, this crisis also reinforces a human reality. Conflict zone flying is not just a technical dispatch matter.
You're quite right. Airlines need more than rerouting. They need disciplined crew planning, proper support, and clear safety governance. Workload, fatigue, uncertainty, and stress all increase in this kind of environment.
And that's another reason why smaller or more fragile airlines are so vulnerable. These events reward disciplined operating models, and they really, really punish improvisation.
And that is worth underlining. In a conflict environment, resilience is not just about balance sheet strength. It is about judgment, control, and operating discipline. In a crisis, disciplined operators cope, improvised operators struggle.
So some closing conclusions. Remco.
Where does this all leave us? The first conclusion is that the Gulf crisis is affecting international aviation, mainly through safety risk, airspace restriction, fuel price inflation, and operational disruption. Insurance matters, but it is not the principal system-wide driver.
The second conclusion is that the impact is uneven. Large Middle East airlines face real pressure, but they also have resilience. Riyadh Air faces a harder launch environment because confidence, timing, and network execution matter enormously for a new entrant. European airlines are squeezed by a narrow operating geography and the dependence on Middle East fuel flows, whilst consumers face higher fares and much more uncertainty. Tourism-dependent island states and remote economies face disproportionate exposure because connectivity is central to their economic model. The smaller state-owned airlines are vulnerable because they often lack margin, flexibility, and indeed strategic clarity, something we go on about a lot.
And the third conclusion is strategic. The Gulf's role in world aviation remains enormous. The crisis does not end that. But it does remind everyone that hub economics depend on something very simple. Confidence. Confidence in safety, confidence in reliability, confidence in price, and confidence in continuity.
And once confidence is shaken, even temporarily, the effects spread far beyond the region itself.
I couldn't have said it better myself.